Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I can see that people are still signing in. My name is Judy Wolf Bolton. I am the CEO of the Osher Marin JCC, and we are so deeply honored to be able to be in conversation with Amy Spitalnick. And I want to do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. At any point during the discussion, we're going to have a conversation first, then we'll also do Q&A. You can put your questions in the Q&A section down at the bottom where there is a question mark, and we will be looking at those throughout the show. So you don't need to wait till the end. As you have the questions, please put them in. I also wanted to let you know that after the briefing this morning, probably tomorrow at some point, we will be sending out the recording, and we do encourage you to share it with others. That's the beauty of these online briefings, is that we can spread the word and more people can participate. There'll also be some JCPA resources that you'll be getting, as well as a couple of other things too. So with that, we're going to get started. I want to say a few things about Amy. We've been very blessed to have Amy be at our site, I think actually a couple of times maybe at this point. I'm really glad that she was willing to do this online briefing. I felt Amy had so many important things to say that I want to make sure that we can get her message and her vision and her insights to as many people as we can that are connected to our JCC. Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. It is a national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy. A little bit about Amy. She is a nationally recognized leader on countering anti-Semitism, hate, extremism, and protecting democracy, all very near and dear to our hearts. Amy previously served as the executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. On a personal note, I want to say that someone who I regard deeply and follow religiously, which is Yehuda Kurtzer from the Shalom Hartman Institute, has a terrific podcast with Amy that I encourage you all to listen to. And he has identified Amy as someone who really inhabits a very important role in the American Jewish establishment. That speaks volumes to me. And that doesn't come lightly. So I know that Yehuda really does deeply value your leadership and insight. Amy, I don't know if there's anything you want to say before I begin with some questions.
No, just so grateful to be back with the JCC team and gratitude to the JCC staff and you, Judy, for making this happen. And I will also say that Yehuda and I are doing a program next week marking the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Stryker Center in New York in person, but there will also be a live stream option. So if folks, I suspect there'll be a lot of similar themes to what we talk about today, but also quite a bit to discuss in terms of what the last 30 years have looked like and the what if questions that many of us, have been asking. And so looking forward to being with Yehuda and former Ambassador Dan Shapiro and Rabin's family for that.
That sounds remarkable and quite another one of those momentous, terrible events. And can't believe it's 30 years. Exactly. And I think that would be fabulous to be able to have the recording to share with our, both the people who are participating today, but then everybody else that was not able to participate. We would like to share that. It would be great. Okay, well, let's start. I have some questions that I would like to be able to ask. This is a conversation. And then, as I said, we'll turn to our participant questions. Amy, this current moment when anti-Semitism is on the rise in ways both new and old, would be great for you to share with us What do you feel the Jewish community is dealing with, and how are these trends concerning?
Absolutely. Look, I think the term anti-Semitism has even become so challenging because it can mean everything and nothing in any moment, right? We're living in a moment of real, legitimate rising anti-Semitism across the ideological spectrum, and none of us in the Jewish community should be gaslit into thinking that this anti-Semitism isn't real. But I think we also need to really, both internal to our community and with potential partners and allies, help people understand what anti-Semitism even means in the first place to actually effectively fight it. And so many people understand anti-Semitism the same as other forms of bigotry, which is true in certain ways. It's a form of prejudice, hating Jews because of who we are, what we look like, how we pray or don't pray, or any other factors along those lines. And we certainly see it manifesting in those very specific ways. What's unique about anti-Semitism is that it's also this insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory really rooted in tropes and lies about Jewish control and power.
Mhm.
And as this conspiracy theory, it doesn't just simply lead to the targeting of Jews, but it really seeks to pit the Jewish community and other communities against one another, to sow distrust in our institutions and in the very fabric of our democracy, and ultimately threaten not just the Jewish community, but all communities and our society writ large. And that's what makes it such a salient wedge across the political spectrum at a time when we're seeing it really rise and being exploited in a number of ways.
Mhm.
And so we know that this goes in both directions, that certainly inclusive pluralistic democracy is inherent to Jewish safety. And so too is Jewish safety existential to protecting and advancing inclusive pluralistic democracy. But right now we're in this feedback loop where anti-Semitism and democracy are really fueling one another, or threats to democracy are fueling one another. We're in this feedback loop in which
Yeah.
anti-Semitism and threats to democracy fuel one another. And as anti-Semitism becomes more and more normalized in all of its forms, it's sowing that distrust and division and threatening not just Jews, but all communities in our democracy, as I talked about. And so too, as our democracy erodes, the rule of law, the values and norms that have been so inherent to Jewish safety, it creates conditions for anti-Semitism to further flourish. And so we're in this loop, and it requires us to think about how we lean into the hard work of relationship and coalition building at a time when it's never been harder, because the goal of extremists is, of course, to divide us, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. Um, and it also requires us to understand how our legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism and the threats to democracy are being used to offer us false choices in this moment. Because we're being told not only that countering real and rising anti-Semitism somehow requires us to abandon our democratic norms and values. We're told that we can't protect ourselves if we want to protect our democracy, that we can't protect Jews if we want to protect other minorities. And the truth is that one is not possible with the other. And this also isn't a simple left versus right issue, even though some might like to paint it that way. And it would perhaps be easier to think about it in those binary terms. And it's important to understand how it's manifesting across the ideological spectrum. On the right, we're seeing from the White House on down a very explicit effort to exploit our real legitimate fears of anti-Semitism to undermine the rule of law and core democratic norms, due process, research and academic freedom at universities, and so much more, including the right to association and organize as unions come under threat. And we know that, of course, when one person's fundamental civil rights and civil liberties are threatened, it erodes and threatens the rights of all communities. And we're also seeing, particularly from the federal government, an effort to not just pit Jewish safety against democracy, but further normalize real dangerous anti-Semitism, right? Giving a platform to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement, which have fueled a cycle of violence, including the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history in Pittsburgh. We just marked the 7-year anniversary earlier this week. And we're now seeing those same conspiracy theories underpin dehumanizing policies, targeting immigrants and voting rights, and so much more. We're seeing extremists appointed to senior roles in defense and counterterror and so many other key places just a few weeks ago. And there was a story in the Times about this that we were a part of last week. Particularly looking at how the appointment of folks like Paul Ingrassia, who now has notoriously said he has a Nazi streak,
Mhm.
is indicative of sort of how these hate and conspiracy theories have become so normalized in the highest levels of power. And we're also seeing the very programs we need to counter anti-Semitism and hate being gutted, from the Office of Civil Rights, which enforces Title VI in our schools and college campuses, to hate crime prevention grants, to so much more. And so we are seeing not just the pitting of Jewish safety against democracy by those on the right, including the federal administration, but also direct policies and the gutting of programs that fundamentally make Jews and so many others less safe. And so too, on the other end of the ideological spectrum, on the far left, we're seeing efforts to pit anti-Semitism, Jewish safety, our connection to Israel as the Jewish homeland, even if we don't agree with its government, against core human and small d democratic rights, right?
Yep.
Legitimate concerns about Palestinian dignity and human rights, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the war, and the fragile ceasefire are being used to isolate or marginalize and attack Jews from some of the very coalitions and spaces and institutions that have been inherent to our own advancement in this country. Some celebrating the attacks of October 7th, some trying to ban, quote, Jews or ban Jews or, quote, Zionists from certain spaces. And of course, as we've seen increasingly so over the last few months, violently targeting Jews here under the guise of protesting Israeli policy, including the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home in Pennsylvania and the DC and Boulder attacks this spring. And so, what we need to do is recognize not just the unique way that anti-Semitism operates as this conspiracy theory that fundamentally threatens not just the Jewish community, but all communities and our democracy, but recognize that the path to Jewish safety and to the safety and rights of all communities is bound with the safety of us as Jews. And we need to act as though our fight against anti-Semitism is only as strong as our democracy, and our democracy is only as strong as the safety of Jews and all communities. And it's this two-way street that so oftentimes gets lost in the binary conversations and the false choices that were being offered. But the only path forward is one that realizes our safety is inextricably linked with that of others, both for us to mobilize as Jews at a time when democracy and all communities are facing real threats, and so too for potential partners and allies to understand their personal stake in fighting anti-Semitism right now.
Wow. I can tell part of this conversation, what makes it hard for me is I'm learning from you as I'm going. And you're so eloquent, and you touch on so many, just in that statement, so many things we are all dealing with every day. And so I appreciate that greatly. Um, I love the concept of the feedback loop because it helps to kind of, in in a phrase, sort of capture at least what I'm feeling every day. And that a lot of the things that you bring up, maybe for a lot of our listeners, is very easy. I know for me, it's hard because I get very focused on how I feel as a Jewish person, a Jewish mother, and a Jewish community leader. And it's just very challenging because that's kind of how I open my day and what I think about. And it's very hard. So I wonder if you have any advice, just following on what you just said, about how do we keep these things, these concepts that you just shared, front of mind when we're feeling this very immediate thing. Do I wear my star? Do I wear my kippah? Do I say that I'm Jewish? Do I, my kids have Hebrew names. I know that they think about it now. So, just very basic things like that.
Yeah. Look, I feel that tension too on a daily basis. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. I'm someone who has been deeply engaged in the Jewish community my entire life, former Hillel
Yeah.
president, former USY president.
Yeah.
I'm a Jewish mother raising a Jewish kid in this world. And
Yeah.
so particularly in the last few years, but I would say over the last decade, especially, more broadly, these tensions have been front and center in terms of how do we show up as Jews, how do we stay proudly Jewish, and how do we do so in a way that also doesn't lose sight of the universal and the
Mhm.
fact that ultimately our safety depends on not walking away from the broader work of democracy and safety and rights of all communities. And especially post October 7th, the loudest voices have told us that that's not possible, that the only way for Jews to be safe is to walk away, that, for example, no one showed up for us after October 7th. And the truth is, multiple things are true at the same time. That
Yeah.
there were absolutely those who I think broke our heart, who did not know how to show up for the Jewish community, or worse, engaged in rhetoric or policies that actively harmed the Jewish community, especially post October 7th, but frankly, long before that too.
Yeah.
But also, there were many who did show up. I think about the Black civil rights leader, one of my colleagues in the work for years, who called me on October 8th and said, "Look, I don't know if
Mhm.
you have family or friends in Israel, but I imagine today is really hard, and you're feeling the impact of what happened there. And just know that I'm here." And I think
Mhm.
that our partners in the work, who don't necessarily agree with us on everything related to Israel and Gaza or foreign
Right.
policy, but are willing to keep showing up and speaking out against anti-Semitism because they know that it is so crucial, not just to the safety of the Jewish community, but to the fabric of our society and our democracy. And so it's hard, right? Like, the goal of this is really to make us feel as if we're isolated and alone, as if
Mhm.
there's only, two stark choices. And the reality is it's much more complicated. And our work at JCPA, as is I think the work of so many people who do community relations and bridge building and coalition building, right? And to instead figure out how we can both continue to proudly and unequivocally show up as Jews in this moment, and do so in a way that doesn't lose sight of how our proud identity as Jews is inextricably linked with our democracy and with the safety of all communities.
Yeah. Uh, very important. I'd love you to say a little bit more about allyship because for whatever reason, a lot of the things that you might have experienced in your national leadership spot didn't reach a lot of people. It just, and I don't know if it was the news choices or I have no idea, but there was this sense of reinforcing that we're very alone and our partners and our allies were not there. So I think it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about allyship that you either saw or you see on the horizon or something about that.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. I think first and foremost, here's the good news, that if you look at the poll data, the vast majority of people, while certainly anti-Semitism is rising, and sort of, you could look at the frightening poll data about anti-Semitism, about propensity to engage in political violence, and all of the things that I think many of us know at this point. But if
Yeah.
you also dig into the data, at the end of the day, the majority of Americans, the majority of those engaging on these issues still fundamentally can hold these multiple truths, might have evolving and complex feelings about what's happening in the Middle East, but understand the ways in which Jewish safety here should not be impacted, are willing to speak out against anti-Semitism. The question for us is, how do we actually do the level setting, both within our
Yeah.
community and with potential allies and partners, so they understand what it means to actually show up as an ally? Because
Yeah.
I think that that is what's gotten lost in so much of the conversation over the last 2 years, particularly post October 7th. Extreme voices on both ends made it seem like the only way to be supportive of the Jewish community or to recognize Israeli humanity alongside Palestinian humanity was to effectively support the actions of the Israeli government or Bibi Netanyahu.
Yep.
And the truth is that most American Jews, and I think at this point, if you look at the protests, most Israelis,
Yeah.
are not necessarily supportive of the government, even if they are deeply committed to the Jewish democratic homeland and, of course, the safety of Jews around the world. And so helping people do that level setting, right? Showing up in this moment doesn't mean putting an Israeli flag on your front door or supporting the actions of Netanyahu or what's happening in Gaza in terms of the humanitarian crisis. It doesn't mean unequivocally endorsing the policies of any government, whether here or there.
Right. Yeah.
It simply means recognizing that Israelis are equally worthy of humanity and dignity as Palestinians, including the hostages, of which there are still remains in Gaza. As grateful as we are that all the living hostages are finally home, it means recognizing the horrors of October 7th instead of celebrating or denying them, or diminishing them. And that can be done alongside unequivocally standing for Palestinian human rights and dignity. And so too here, right? It's rejecting those zero-sum frameworks that tell us there's only so much pie to go around. And if we're going to fight anti-Semitism, it means taking away from the fight against Islamophobia or anti-Arab hate or racism or so much more, which is both myopic in that the Jewish community itself is incredibly diverse, and there are Jews of color and LGBTQ Jews and so many others who are facing compounding forms of bigotry. And so too, as we've been talking about, does Jewish safety and the safety of all communities go hand in hand, and that there's not a limited amount of pie, but rather the most effective way to keep us safe as Jews and for any community to be safe is to combat it in a deeply connected and holistic way. And so it's rejecting these zero-sum frameworks, both in terms of the conflict and here, that helps allies and potential allies understand how to show up in this moment. And in turn minimizes those extreme voices who thrive, right? Extremism thrives on making us feel isolated and alone. That's why anti-Semitism as this conspiracy theory is so rooted in the goal of pitting communities against one another and sowing distrust and division. That's how extremism grows and thrives. And so the solution is to reject those binary approaches, as we've been talking about, and help allies and partners understand that they can really hold this complexity and that multiple things can be true, and that showing up doesn't mean necessarily showing up in unequivocal support of any specific policy or
Yeah.
government, but showing up for the humanity and dignity of our community.
I, I I totally embrace what you're saying, and I know on a personal level, and I'm even someone who is, running a Jewish organization. So in some ways it's easier. I just know that a lot of people struggle with this so much on a very daily basis. So I do like us all absorbing what you're saying and then thinking about how can I do this, so that I'm not following into just the binary approach, and really trying to broaden. We did get a question right now that I thought sort of fits with what we're talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and integrate it.
Yes.
How to contend with the litmus test presented by progressives that we as Jews need to prove we are anti-Zionist or against Israel. Speaking as a Zionist who strongly believes Israel's existence is non-negotiable.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And I typically even talk about, I typically try to unpack the term Zionism in some of these
Yeah,
conversations because I think the lack of understanding of the term Zionism is actually fueling these sorts of litmus tests in certain spaces.
I
And in
agree.
other cases, it's more of a deliberate, clearly anti-Semitic effort. And so I think it's both being clear that there's a total lack of understanding of what Zionism means among most people, and how the term has been exploited and weaponized as a pejorative by extremists who are seeking to not just, weigh in on Israeli policy, but really marginalize, exclude, and discriminate against Jews. And so I can share what I share when I'm oftentimes,
Great.
talking to progressive coalitions and leaders and elected officials, which is what Zionism means to me. And I think it's important for those of us to have a connection to Israel, which is the vast majority of American Jews, to actually talk about what that relationship means. Because again,
Hmm.
it's different than what people might perceive, right? The connection to a Jewish homeland is a key part of the Jewish identity of many American Jews. And Zionism to me simply means the belief that Jews are entitled to self-determination, to a homeland somewhere in this place in the world where we have deep historical connections. And for me and so many others, it goes hand in hand with my belief in Palestinian self-determination, humanity, and dignity. And I personally believe one can't exist without the other, that ultimately, if we're going to have a Jewish and democratic Israel, Palestinians need self-determination as well. And Palestinian self-determination and long-term security requires Jewish self-determination, humanity, dignity, and security as well. And so that's what Zionism means to me. And when 80 to 90% of American Jews have that relationship with Israel, that belief in the importance of a Jewish homeland, even if, again, we don't agree with its government at any given
Right.
moment or the government's policies, it effectively becomes a form of anti-Semitic discrimination to say that Zionists are banned, right? We're from a
Yeah,
certain space, from an organization, from
exactly.
artists and literary spaces that have faced litmus tests like this. And so starting the conversation about what this term actually even means with those who are willing to engage constructively, while also recognizing that there are those who will always use the term as a pejorative because it is really just a cover to advance a broader form of anti-Jewish discrimination. But giving people the benefit of the doubt when we know the term, according to, pull data and conversations I'm
Yeah.
sure all of us have had, is so misunderstood, gives us the opportunity to really help tell the story of what it truly means to so many of us, and the complex and I think lowest common denominator of what that actually means, even as the term is twisted in the public conversation and is used to suggest policies or beliefs that don't necessarily align with many of us who would identify as a Zionist.
Yeah. I like the way that you framed it very much. I'm going to go off on this a little bit more. Um, I thought it was very interesting the question when they mentioned about progressives. And I think that there's probably a number of people on the webinar who are sort of like me. I started out as a more progressive Democrat, and I've generally been moving right because of these, particularly over the last 2 years when I feel the anti-Zionism. I live in the East Bay. It's so prominent here, and it just feels like it's a constant issue that I have to deal with liberal Democrats. It's getting harder and harder. So I'm just wondering if you can provide some other insights, because sometimes we feel like we're speaking to other Jewish people very much, and it anyway, I would be curious to know insights that you can share for us to think about as we go
Yeah.
forward.
And I'm not sure that you are necessarily the one moving, Judy, and I think that's probably true for many, right? I think the Overton window on both ends of the political spectrum have moved in recent years, and that
I
you
do
have
agree. Yes.
we talked about it earlier, right? Those on the far right who are normalizing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and, things that the Nazis in Charlottesville said and chanted 8 years ago are now being espoused on, young Republican chats and by appointees
Yeah.
in the federal government. And so, to your point, those on the far left who are moving well away from legitimate criticism of Israeli policy into what we've been talking about, the ways in which that crosses into overt, clear anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jews, or increasingly violence.
Yeah.
And so understanding that I don't think we as Jews are probably moving, but on both ends of the political spectrum, we've seen these Overton window shifts feels important. And also, again, I still think the majority of people are able to sort of hold the complexity.
Yeah.
So, I'll share, I don't know, I'll share two stories. And I think one of them I shared with you when I was at the JCC the other month. Last summer, we put out a report from the JCPA about anti-Semitism and democracy. And after that report, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who represents New York, invited me to do a webinar for her followers on social media. And certainly, as folks can imagine, there are some strong feelings about AOC in parts of the Jewish community or disagreements with her as it relates to Israel and Gaza. And also, frankly, it was, I think, a major opportunity for her thousands and thousands and thousands of followers to hear a real and frank conversation about
Yeah.
anti-Semitism in all of its
Yeah.
forms, to hear from someone like me, who's very different than who they might have previously heard from on these issues, someone who identifies as, liberal or progressive Zionist, and who talks about what Zionism means to me. And so we had this conversation. It was a frank conversation. You can
Yeah.
watch it online. It's available on YouTube, and on the
Great.
JCPA website, on AOC's YouTube and the JCPO's website. And we talked about all of this, everything that we've talked about here, what
Hmm.
anti-Semitism looks like across the ideological spectrum, the threat that it poses to progressive values, to peace in the Middle East, if you actually ostensibly care about that, and that it is real across the ideological spectrum. And in particular, having someone like AOC, who is, I would argue,
Yeah.
among the most prominent, if not the most prominent progressives in the country, say those things was incredibly important. Even
Hmm.
more so the next day here in New York, where I live, we had this horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova Memorial exhibition in
Hmm.
Lower Manhattan. And AOC put out a statement unequivocally naming that as anti-Semitism,
Wow.
which was important for her as a progressive leader,
Yeah.
but also created the permission structure for other progressives to
Hmm.
see that you can actually be clear-eyed and unequivocal in naming anti-Semitism, even if you have fundamental disagreements or opposition with the Israeli government. And of course, extremes on both ends tried to cancel us for this conversation. The far
Yeah.
right of our community did not like that I talked to her. The far left, including a chapter of the Democratic Socialists, actually unendorsed her, citing the webinar, among
Wow.
other things.
Wow.
And her office has since been graffitied, which isn't to say that I agree with her on everything. We've had both public and private disagreements on certain rhetoric or policies. But the fact is that she engaged constructively on this, named the reality of anti-Semitism across the political spectrum, including in the real ways it was showing up in New York,
Hmm.
and ultimately was attacked by those on the far left for doing so. And so, how
Yeah.
we can figure out where that line is between who we can engage constructively and in a nuanced way, even if there are disagreements, from those like the DSA activists who will never see the humanity and dignity of Jews or Israelis and think that her having a conversation on anti-Semitism is worthy of an endorsement. For me, that's the work. How do we find those voices? How do we engage them? How do we lift them up to help move others? Even if we're also going to continue to disagree and argue about specific policies. And you don't move the needle by only talking to people with whom you agree. You move the
Yeah.
needle by finding those you disagree with, but who are willing to engage constructively. And so for me, that was so diagnostically significant in terms of, and
Yes.
we do a lot of work, whether it's with the Congressional Progressive Caucus or local progressive elected officials, civil rights, democracy, labor spaces, where so many of these issues are also playing out. And the way to engage is through this through direct conversation, talking about the elephants in the room, being clear about what we mean. And I will say, I think, we're a nonpartisan organization at JCPA, as I know the JCC is as
Yes.
well. I was at the Democratic National Convention last summer to do a number of programs, educational programs on anti-Semitism and democracy and related issues. And I think, there were certainly extreme voices who were trying to co-opt the narrative that week as it related to Israel and Gaza and Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff and so much more. And certainly that was also at the time that, some of the language around Josh Shapiro and the potential VP was swirling right after that.
Exactly.
It was right after that. But at the actual convention, I think about when the Poland, when Rachel and John were there, how I stood in that arena and watched the entire arena chant, "Bring them home."
Mm.
And not because they were all of a sudden, wrapping themselves in Israeli flags and becoming dyed-in-the-wool Zionists, but saw the plight of the hostages and saw it as part of their values and part of this. And so too, was Doug Emhoff proudly talking about his Jewish heritage and family from the stage. And so I think it's also important to again think about how we fracture off the extreme voices who want to co-opt the narrative, who will never see the humanity and dignity of people like Rachel and John or Hirsch,
Right.
who will never, believe that someone like Doug Emhoff should be leaning into his Jewish identity, from those who actually see it as part of the fabric of what the Democratic Party or frankly our small d democratic society should be. And
Yeah.
that's the work, right? And it's
Yeah,
hard
it is.
work because the extreme voices get disproportionate attention and megaphone and oxygen. But at the end of the day, I still deeply believe that the majority of people, again, can hold that complexity and hold those values at a time when they're being pulled to the polls.
I really appreciate that. I know that, I think a lot of people, there's a fear element and it's sort of, I only can do so much, so I really like you reinforcing these concepts. I read somewhere, which I really liked, that you had written about maybe that you had kind of three sort of suggestions, which I liked them very much. I think about that: stay at the table, invest in democratic resiliency, and reject false binaries. Those are very much what you've been talking about. And I think that they can help us all in that day to day experience of just kind of, sometimes you just want to hunker down and not address these things. And, you know, that kind of captures. So I don't know if you want to say anything about those three things, but I like that, those three.
Absolutely. So, I think, staying at the table, we've talked about
Yeah.
the AOC or the Democratic Party, and I would argue, right, for those who have credibility and relationships on the other end of the political spectrum, we all need to do the same.
Yep.
But the Jewish community is too often told to walk away from those with whom we have disagreements or differing views, including and especially on Israel,
Yes.
but certainly as it relates to a number of related issues as well. And we see, of course, how extremists specifically seek to use this to further divide us, right? To divide our coalitions, to divide those of us who are fighting for democracy right now, as is very clearly happening. Because as we've been talking about, we know that isolation is the key tactic of extremists. It's making us feel as if we're alone, to divide us and sow distrust and division. And so the work that we do at JCPA, and we work closely with Jewish community relations councils around the country, including
Yes.
the Bay Area JCRC, which is a great partner, and a number of other partners who are on the front lines of coalition and bridge building. The real work of community relations means being willing to stay at the table and talk about those elephants in the room and have hard, frank conversations, even and especially when it's challenging. And this is something that all of us should do. You don't need to lead a JCRC or the JCPA, right? We are all having these exact conversations in our offices, in our neighborhoods, in our families,
It
right?
is.
And
Yes.
so
Yes.
it's so important that we stay at the table because that's the only way we'll actually advance that understanding. And again, we're not fighting anti-Semitism by only talking to people who already understand the concerns and are aligned
Mhm.
with us. Exactly. In terms of investing in democratic resiliency, I think we so often think about about protecting our communities from anti-Semitism and sort of physical measures.
Yes.
And those matter, certainly. And I will say, particularly at this moment when nonprofit security grants are frozen, and now there's a whole political fight around some of the terms and conditions that are being woven into them that might force synagogues and other institutions to choose between their deeply held values and accepting money for security cameras and other sort of hard security
Yeah.
measures. That matters, and we should not be Pollyanna-ish about that. And I would say so too, right? Legal accountability and the justice system matter. And I say this as someone who, focused on legal accountability for anti-Semitic neo-Nazis. And also, we can't simply sue or barricade or prosecute our way out of this crisis. We need to invest in also building the resiliency to hate in the first place so we're not simply, catching the anti-Semitic extremists when they're about to attack, including just, I don't know if folks saw the news, another, potential synagogue attack in the South that was reported late last night. Like, we're living at a time when these threats are real, but how do we build the resiliency to prevent people from becoming extremists in the first place? And that's tools like media and digital
Yeah.
literacy, and of course, holding social media companies accountable. It's hate crimes prevention grants at a time when they're getting gutted by the federal government. It's defending democratic norms and the rule of law and equal justice so our justice system is working and people are all given a fair shake. It's investing in the civil rights of students on college campuses and K through 12 schools and in the education that helps prevent people from being susceptible to extremism in the first place. And ultimately, it's a whole of government and whole of society approach to countering hate and extremism. And so,
Yeah.
understanding that fighting anti-Semitism is not just the hard physical security, but really the broader democratic resiliency that is so inherent to preventing it in the first place. And then finally, right, we've been talking about false binaries and false
Yeah.
choices for this whole conversation. And I really think it's among the greatest challenges that we face, not just in terms of countering anti-Semitism, but more broadly in this moment of deep polarization and deep
Yeah.
sort of extremism and political violence rising in the United States. It's this binary thinking that all the research tells us is inextricably linked with a willingness to engage in violence. And I think really the ways in which the fabric of our society have become so frayed. And so, whether it is, what we talked about in terms of understanding there's enough pie to go around in the fight against hate that we can counter anti-Semitism and it doesn't take away from countering any other form of hate or vice versa, or
Hmm.
rejecting the zero-sum approach to understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and helping people understand they can recognize the humanity and dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians without endorsing the policies of a specific government or leader on either side. And so it's bringing that nuance and complexity to conversations that helps potential allies understand that they don't have to walk away from their values in a way and can do so in a way that is also clear about countering anti-Semitism and the importance of Jewish safety at a time when we know both, core small d democratic values are under threat. And again, the Jewish community and so many others are facing unprecedented hate. And it's not making people choose that
Yeah.
is so inherent to how we actually build the coalitions we need to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, I like your overall concept too about, holding both truths at the same time. That's something I really got from you and a lot of things I've read. And it's just trying to do these things on a everyday basis, as you said, in all these different circles. We do have a few questions from others, but I want to do a couple more for you. I, I was impressed about JCPA having been around for 80 years. And I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about how do you feel things have changed of where we are now from then, or just whatever you want to say related to the work you're doing at JCPA in current day.
So, JCPA was founded in 1944 at a deeply dark time in Jewish
Right.
history, and it came out of the recognition as Jews here were quite literally trying to bang down the White House door to get the administration's attention to what was happening to Jews
Hmm.
in Europe. um, that the only way to keep Jews safe here and around the globe was to build strong coalitions across communities that could build our political power, could build our impact, and ultimately help raise the voice of all communities that were facing threat. And so that was the genesis of JCPA in 1944. And since then, we've really been on the front lines of so much of this work. In 1950, we co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights with the NAACP and some labor unions. We're still a
Yeah.
very proud and active member. I sit on the board, and that Civil Rights Coalition has been one of the most important spaces that I think we've been a part of, both in terms of advocacy in fighting hate and protecting democracy right now, but also in the behind the scenes and public facing work to keep our coalitions together at this really fraught moment. And so too has JCPA really been on the front lines of mobilizing Jews to show up, for civil rights. My predecessor, Arnie Aronson, is in all of those, is standing right next to MLK in these
Yeah.
photos from the
Yeah.
March on Washington and the meetings at the White House, because JCPA really was rooted in this recognition that we've been talking about, that our safety is intertwined. And this isn't to say
Mm.
that our community lost its way necessarily, but I think as Jewish safety became more assured in the United States. And I'm someone who grew up in, what has some have described as the golden age of
Yes.
American Jewry. I don't know if I believe that. I think anti-Semitism has always been there. But certainly I grew up at a time when it felt like it was pushed into the shadows, at least, or at least marginalized in a way that it's not right now. And so as we saw that, I think we walked away from the work in community relations and bridge building and thought about other things that are also deeply important to the Jewish community, Israel advocacy and things like JCCs and so much more that we must be investing in, but how
Yes.
we do so with a lens for community relations and not walking away from that coalition work. And I will say, we work with JCRCs around the country, and they are crucial and also so under-resourced and so stretched thin. In the Bay Area, you are lucky to have a large and independent JCRC that has an amazing team and leadership. In so many places, it's like one or barely, a part-time staffer, if any, who's leading this work. And so our work at JCPA is really to support the field, whether it's the big JCRCs, the smaller ones that have very little staff, if any, and we're just lay leaders,
Hmm.
or other community relations partners, from rabbis and clergy to JCCs, who
Right.
oftentimes, are, as we've talked about, Judy, the fact that so it's not just Jews who are walking through the door of the JC, it's so
100%.
many others, right?
So many others.
So how do we think about what it means to really invest in community relations after years in which we are kind of disinvesting from it because we didn't think it was as necessary. We felt like we were safe here. And the last decade, but especially the last few years, have put a fine point on the fact that we actually need to be investing more deeply and more strategically in this work, that the pain and the fear that so many of us are rightfully feeling right now is not because we've failed on the community relations front or that community relations isn't important, but rather because we haven't invested more deeply in it. And so there's a huge opportunity, and I think it's part of why, our work at JCPA is continuing to grow. We've built out so many programs on the strategic community relations front over the last few years to support the field. And it goes hand in hand with the broader work we do that I've been describing, whether it's with elected officials, whether it's with teachers unions, whether it's with civil rights and pro-democracy coalitions. And so how we come back to sort of the values and the vision that were at the genesis of JCPA 81 years ago for me was, I think, what drew me to this work in the first place, and the ways in which October 7th and the broader moment of political polarization and extremism have only underscored that urgency is now even more clear than it was, when I started this role a little over 2 years ago.
Very interesting. And I appreciate you highlighting about that we've sort of sat back on our laurels a bit related to building out Jewish community relations. And, I think as I don't know if we want to say the war is over or if it's in this new phase, but it does feel that we can move a little past October 7th now and move into, maybe it's an opportunity to be rebuilding in those areas, as you said, is happening at a national and, a level across the country, but to think more in our own local areas too. How do we really go about doing that? Because you're right, like for me, I think about all the non-Jewish people who are part of our everyday world at the JCC, and the commingling of Jewish and non-Jewish people caring for democracy and caring for Jewish safety and the safety of all. So it's something that we really think
And
about.
and I'll say we were really not post we were still in the trauma of October 7th. I think many of us still rightfully
I
are.
think so
There is
too.
still there are still remains of the hostages, but again, thankfully the living hostages are home. We have this precarious ceasefire, but we haven't been able to move to the post-trauma phase over 2 years after October 7th. And
Totally.
I think when we move into the post-trauma phases, I hope the next few weeks allow us to begin to do, and that the ceasefire holds, and that we move towards a broader, sustainable future here. That in turn allows us to really step back and think about how we continue to build this work in a way that is impactful and not just informed by the trauma, which we are rightfully feeling, but also about a forward-looking approach.
Well, that might be the focus of a future dialogue between us, is that post-trauma um, way that we can kind of come to the table, as because I do think we are still very fraught with the emotional and the day-to-day experience, and standing up for Israel, all the things you've already spoken about, still very challenging. Since we're at almost 10 till, I do want to ask, I'm going to open up the Q&A and read a couple of the questions that we got. So this is, what can you say about the upcoming New York mayoral election?
So this is near and dear to me. I'm a New
Yeah,
Yorker. I spent years of my career in New York government, including in City Hall and the mayor's office, and believe so deeply in the importance and power of local government to not just, make lives better for people, but truly keep people safe.
yeah,
And I think, we're right now, and again, I run a 501(c)(3), so I'm very careful about how we engage here. And voting has already started in New York because we have early voting. And so we're at a very key moment where I will, not try to mince my words, but make clear that I'm not trying to weigh in one way or another around a candidate. I
yeah,
think this mayoral race, and I would say in particular the primary win for Mamdani, has really become a Rorschach test. And people are
yeah,
seeing in it their worst fears and instincts. So there are those on the left who are saying, look, it's indicative of the fact that people actually don't support Israel, or that, that this is a referendum on foreign policy, even though we know the vast majority of New Yorkers are not voting on foreign policy or on his positions on Israel and Gaza. They're voting on affordability and education and transit and all of the things that the mayor controls in a real way on a daily basis.
yeah,
And so too, on the other extreme, you have those who are using this to say, "Hey, look, the Democratic Party hates Israel. That in the that in the Jews are not safe here. Jews should leave New York." Or in some of the worst cases, some explicitly Islamophobic and extremist rhetoric targeting
yes,
Mamdani that has just frankly been disgusting.
yeah,
And so, and it's been fascinating for me because I spend a lot of my time on the road, but I'm a New Yorker. And so the interest in the mayoral race around the country is far more intense than it is almost here in New York. I hear
that's
more
interesting.
from folks around the country than here, because I think the national media on this has really hyped up some of the polarizing conversations, when I think at the end of the day, the vast majority of New Yorkers, while certainly his positions on Israel and Jewish safety and all of those questions matter, and we can talk about that, the end of the day, most New Yorkers are still voting on questions of affordability. And if Mamdani wins next week, it will be because he ran a compelling campaign on affordability at a time when New Yorkers are feeling that squeeze, right? And so I think it's important for us to be clear about that.
Yeah,
That being said, I think there two things are true here, and this ties in with what we've been talking about. Of course,
mm,
it's incumbent on our leaders to be unequivocal in naming and calling out hate wherever it exists. And I think there have been some comments and approaches to talking about Israel that by Mamdani that, of course, are not only out of step with the Jewish community, but I think
right,
actually with where a lot of people are.
yeah,
In particular, some of the focuses on things like, that related to, arresting Netanyahu or something like that, that of course, like, is not actually related to the day-to-day of what New Yorkers are thinking about from their mayor. And I also think this, right, the fact is that this is a lens through which we should understand the urgency of bringing nuance and complexity to the Israel and Palestinian conversation. And that I am among the last generation of, Mamdani's younger than me. I'm among the last generation of not just American Jews, but Americans who knew an Israel that was under existential threat, except for October 7th, that knew an Israel that wasn't led by Netanyahu,
Yeah,
that saw
that's
the
true.
Second Intifada and, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and all of these pieces that I think are just removed from the reality of understanding Israel for younger Americans. And we're going
Totally.
to see this across the ideological spectrum continue to be a challenge. And unless we help people understand that they can, be supportive of the Jewish right to self-determination and Jewish safety and dignity, Israeli safety and dignity in a way that, again, is not rejecting their core progressive or other values, we're only going to continue to reinforce the binaries here. And
Yeah.
so, the Democratic Party is not a monolith. I don't think that Mamdani is like the new face of the Democratic Party in the way that some like to say, but I think he is certainly reflective of the fact that we need to break out of these binaries on Israel if we're going to have a realistic conversation on it. And so, too, do we need our leaders, even if they are not directly engaging in foreign policy, to recognize the power of their bully pulpit. And most importantly, I would say, I hope that as folks go to the polls and think about how they're going to vote in New York and what we can do right now, we're thinking about what the mayor can actually do to keep Jews safe. And that is public safety and education and hate crimes prevention. And again, using that platform to make sure that this is a city and that all cities are places where Jews and all people can truly be safe. And so it's hard and it's messy. And for me, I feel like there's no candidate in the race right now that is actually reflecting where the majority of Jews are
Yeah.
on this issue. And also that's what this work is. It's not walking away from the table, it's having the hard conversations, it's continuing to move the needle forward. And I've also been grateful to be a part of conversations with our elected leaders and potential leaders to help do that.
Yeah, I like your summation of it being messy because that is how it feels. But I'm so glad that you are representing us in these national coalitions and a lot of work to do. I do have another question came through that I thought was interesting. Um, Hate being exposed, on X, formerly Twitter, has become one of the most dangerous vehicles in history for spreading anti-Semitism. Um, can you say anything about online, any suggestions, recommendations, thoughts?
Absolutely. And we put out a report about a month ago, actually, I think exactly a month ago, with the Center for Countering Digital Hate that specifically looks at the ways in which anti-Semitism has not only been normalized on X, on Twitter,
Yeah.
um, the site formerly known as Twitter, but really monetized in a way that is
Hmm.
incentivizing. And there's so much to say about the report itself. You can read it on our website. And I would encourage folks to do that. But what it really found is that X has become disproportionately one of the most effective vehicles for spreading anti-Semitism, that it's rampant. Our team in CCDH looked at hundreds of thousands of posts that explicitly violated X's stated terms and conditions and policies on anti-Semitism. They got, I think, 193 million views
Wow.
in the
Wow.
less than a year that we were aggregating data for this report. And in particular, we know that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, as we've talked about, have played very well on social media for all the reasons that we've been talking about. We know that moderation has totally failed, right? Elon Musk has notoriously said that like he's fighting anti-Semitism by having these community notes. Guess
Mm.
what? I
Yeah.
think 1% of the anti-Semitic posts we looked at actually had a community note, and the vast majority of them had far less views than the actual anti-Semitic post. And then we know that there are particularly loud and influential anti-Semitism influencers on social media, including X, who have disproportionate platform and are, oftentimes using it to fuel
Yeah.
their own lucrative careers. And they're verified, right? They have a platform that is reinforced. And so too is X. profiting from this. They are,
Interesting.
they're running ads that that are connected to these anti-Semitism influencers and anti-Semitic content and
Wow.
make significant money from it, right?
Yeah.
And so we specifically looked at X, but we know that while this problem might be most pronounced on X, it's not exclusive to X. I think about, this Charlottesville litigation where so much of the evidence in our case came from social media platforms like Discord and Facebook, where Discord, especially, the neo-Nazis planned almost all of the violence down to discussions of hitting protesters with cars, which is, of course, what
Wow.
they did. And so we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that there is, that social media companies have virtually no incentive to do the right thing here, and are in many cases monetizing our legitimate hate and fears that I'm not sure we're going to see the sort of national or global policies we need, like Section
Right.
230 reform here. And so what we can do is teach media and digital literacy, ensure that all of us, including our kids, but not limited to our kids, are smarter and better consumers of the news to inoculate against this hate and extremism in the ways that we talked about, not just through direct education and literacy, but through the broader democratic resiliency and whole of government and society approach to countering hate that we've been mentioning. And so we work at JCPA to advance those policies on the local, state, and national level. We work with partners like CCDH, with Peril at American University that does fantastic research on this, and so many others to provide those sorts of resources and tools to communities and find workarounds at a time when we know the social media company and our federal government are not going to necessarily do what we need here, but we can't just allow this to continue to metastasize.
Yeah, I think this is a big topic and it needs all of us to be thinking about it differently, especially when we know that our younger generation is turning to these vehicles for news, I put in quotes. So I really appreciate everything that you had to say and the push for digital literacy, or however you framed it. I think super important. All right, we are now 1 minute before. I don't know if you have any parting comments, and then I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Unfortunately, there were some questions we couldn't get to, but we will definitely keep them, and we'll try to figure out how we might be able to get answers to those. So, Amy, any final comments before we sign off?
So, we will certainly send some resources around, but folks can visit jewishpublicaffairs.org and you can read that Twitter report. You can find the AOC webinar. You can read about our work with the teachers unions, which I know folks have raised in terms of both the very real
Yes.
challenges related to anti-Semitism in Israel and the opportunities through the partnerships we've launched to try to move that in a more constructive direction. And so much more that we've talked about. You can, including, the federal actions that we folks can advocate for to restore hate crimes prevention funding and Title VI and nonprofit security grants and all of the programs that we know are existential. So jewishpublicaffairs.org. And look, I think the most important thing I'll say is that it's really easy to feel powerless and hopeless in this moment. And that's the exact goal of extremists. It's to make us feel like we're isolated and alone. And the
Mm-hmm.
fact is that the vast majority of people, I think, are still looking to find that complicated middle that many of us have live in and that we've been talking about here, and how we can continue to help our neighbors, our friends, our family, our colleagues reject these false binaries and false choices and lean into real bridge building at a time when, it's not a particularly exciting or sexy idea is I think the only path forward. And so I'm grateful that folks took time out of their busy days for this conversation, and I hope they'll share it around and also more importantly get involved not just with JCPA nationally but locally through the JCC and the JCRC and others to
Yes.
continue to do this work.
Very well stated, and I completely agree. A lot of good work for us. We will be sending out links for everybody who's on here and also for our other lists of people who weren't able to come. And we'll make sure that everyone does have the ability to get to the website. That was a couple of the questions, was how to get the resources. And just my parting shot as a JCC, we are so honored for this conversation. Amy, it was helpful to me, and I am sure it was helpful to everybody participating and those that will be watching it afterwards. We do have an Inside Israel briefing coming up on November 19th, and that will also be in the materials that you'll all get. Thank you so much for joining us, and wish you all well. Thank you, Amy.
Thank
Take
you.
care.